not only want to move ahead then with a wonderful panel of three people who have been deeply involved for many, many years with the JFK assassination, and whose contributions have been extremely important in ferreting out information and in trying to get things disclosed, separate and apart from what Judge Sondheim has referred to. Dr. John Newman is a former military Army analyst. He was for many years professor at the University of Maryland. He's now at James Madison University. He has written many books, and three just came out quite recently, one on JFK and Vietnam, well, which he had actually published before. He may tell you about that, how that was held back and now republished by him, and 2 volumes on what's going to be a 5-volume set covering the entire span of JFK, preceding the assassination and thereafter. We have Jefferson Morley, who's a FOIA litigant expert. He has written several books and many articles on this matter too, and was for many years a very highly respected correspondent reporter for the Washington Post. James Lazar, an attorney here in Washington, D.C., has been handling more FOIA requests. I don't know if Jim has the world's record or not. Got to be pretty close to it. He's the president and founder of the Assassination Archives and Review Center, AARC, and Jim continues to pursue these efforts to obtain that kind of information. So these 3 gentlemen have really been stalwarts among the Warren Commission critic researcher community. So we're going to start off. I think Dr. Newman will be first. I'm going to ask you gentlemen to keep your remarks to about 10-12 minutes, and we'll have a couple of questions for each of you. Andrew has suggested that we do it that way, and then we'll move it along. Okay? You want to come up here, John?
Thank you, Judge Sondheim, for coming. Thank you for your service. And thank you, CAPA, for organizing this event. A couple of amplifications, real quick. A needle in a haystack. Search? Needle in a haystack?
Yes, please.
Okay, so for example,
Sorry, I was tweeting.
as an informant for the CIA in Cuba, Emilio Americo Rodriguez has about 500 pages in the National Archives. His name is redacted every single time. His college, every single time. His identifying numbers, every single time. Except for one time, a reviewer must have had a big lunch and got tired. And on the record identification form, his name was in the clear. And you can take that little needle and go through all 500 pages and put his name in and get the whole story. So that's a needle in a haystack. And I love needles in haystacks. I love this text. One other thing, the judge was talking about cryptonyms and pseudonyms that are very important to me in my current work. 5 volumes is what I'm anticipating doing, but I have to know who these people are and what operations each cryptonym stands for. And they're not all released by any stretch of the imagination. In the 2 volumes that I've just completed in the last 4 years, I myself have broken about 200 plus cryptonyms and over 70 to 100 pseudonyms, and they're in the appendices in my books. And I'm not the only one. There's a couple other real crack researchers. Bill Simpich out there on the West Coast has been very helpful to me in this regard. And so we need cryptonyms and pseudonyms in order to understand the story. Pseudonyms are important because one person can have 2, 3, 4, 5 pseudonyms, and the story gets, broken apart into pieces. And if you can reduce all those names to a single person, then you can tell the story. I really don't want to talk too much about my own work. I really want to just amplify and agree with Judge Sondheim that we need everything released. The CIA has resisted, and as has been mentioned in the Joanides case, in some cases subverted investigations by our elected officials. And maybe Jefferson will tell you a little bit about that. Maybe, and Jim, he's the one who handles litigation, so not for me to talk about that. But the FBI has also resisted from the very start that I can remember when the ARB began their work. I gave you guys a whole bunch of file numbers, and that was sent over to the FBI, and we didn't get anything on it. These were Oswald files. I think that, I'm very interested in what's in these files. Okay, they would be helpful to me, and I know what I want, but honestly, it's more important than what's in the files that we should get them. They belong to us, they belong to our elected officials, and the idea that our current government is continuing to block this information is not going to help the public trust. And so for that reason alone, we need a full release. In my experience of many years of dealing with these records, and I go way back to 1992 and 3 when the first records were released in what was then Narrow 1, downtown, awful place. I copied documents along with some of my friends that helped me, and I have them today, and many of the most crucial ones no longer exist in Narrow. Not to say that they're not at the CIA, but they're no longer at the National Archives and Records Administration. They're walking out under people's shirts. Okay, and I'll give you one example. President Eisenhower had instructed his subordinates to murder not one person, not just Castro, but 3. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo to bring the Europeans on board to support our anti-Castro policy, and Trujillo in the Dominican Republic in order to bring the Organization of American States to support our anti-Castro policy. It was a triple play in terms of putting together a coalition that would help Eisenhower get what he wanted to overthrow Castro. And some of those documents no longer exist, particularly ones that relate to the order that Eisenhower gave for the assassination of Lumumba, and then his national security advisor giving testimony on one day to the church committee saying that no, Eisenhower didn't have any idea of assassination, and 5 days earlier told 5 church committee staff members just the opposite. Well, I have those documents, both of them, and I have the original RIF sheets, record identification forms, but they no longer exist. And what the staff discussion has been now abridged from 9 pages to just 3, with the piece that I just told you left out. And it gets worse than that. The record identification database itself for that document now has from 0 to 0, date 0, number of pages 0, everything zeroed out. I have the RIF sheet, the original RIF sheet that has all the information. So how does that stuff disappear? Okay, somebody has tinkered with the actual system itself. And so one of the reasons I want full release is I want to see what's in there. I want full release because I think we deserve it, but I also want full release because I think if we get it, it's going to help make the case to go back to these agencies and find the stuff where it is and get it in the archives where it belongs. This isn't unimportant information. The information relating to assassination of foreign leaders and the church committee's investigation of that is central. It's crucial. So, and that's the kind of stuff, not innocuous stuff, that's the kind of important stuff that's been gradually disappearing over the years. So I want what's in the remaining files, and I want what was originally released as well. And I think if we get a full release, it'll help make the case. And while I'm not wild about our current president, I'm really hoping that his relationship with the CIA continues like it is right now, because it's probably the best, most lucky that we're ever going to have to get through this. Because I think that the judge made a good point. In this post 9/11 atmosphere, it's going to be a lot harder to get stuff released. So maybe Trump will do us a favor.
John, well, John, just to add the relationship of the president and the CIA playing out to our favor, how about the relationship of the president with Putin? And you have access to every goddamn thing that exists over there in Russia. Okay. Anybody have any questions, Jared?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's exactly relevant, but it is relevant.
Make it relevant, please.
It's just regarding the stuff you've been talking about. I've heard people talking about that, and some suggestions that they might be up in Gettysburg at the Eisenhower Library. And
Abilene,
I
Abilene is where this library is. Abilene.
Okay, and I live near there. I mean, if I knew what I was looking for, I'd love to go up there and look for it.
Gordon Gray stuff. Gordon Gray's National Security Advisor. Okay, next question.
Okay.
What about the records that are missing, like the Air Force One tapes and the ONI defector records and the ONI investigative reports? These are not part of the collection. Is anyone looking for them?
You are. I know that. It's looking hard for it, but I don't think that they were in the collection in the first place. So I don't know what we do about that.
Thanks, John. Thanks. To hear these kinds of remarks from someone who was an Army intelligence officer, a professor, an author, and someone who devoted all his time, really should give everybody pause. Okay, our next presenter is Jefferson Morley. Jeff, please.
So I've been at this longer than I care to admit. I first met Judge Tunheim 25 years ago when he started this job, and I had incredible admiration for him. I was in the Washington Post newsroom at the time, and the whole topic of the assassination of Kennedy was this polarizing thing that made people angry and all that. I was just very impressed that a public official would come forward and treat it in the straightforward manner that it deserved, and that he showed tonight. So thank you, John, for that. What I would like to say about the coming release and what's going to happen in October 2017, first of all, you can see between two very well-informed people, John and John, you know, we don't even know exactly what's in there because, it's not clear whether all the cryptonyms have been released and all that. So that's another argument in favor of full disclosure. The record itself is not transparent now. I think the most important thing when people say, well, you know, what's in there, what's coming, what are we going to find out in October 2017, I think the first question you have to answer is, what do we know now that we didn't know then when the law was passed? What do we know now that we didn't know in 1992? And an incredible amount. And the JFK Records Collection has transformed the scholarship, not only around the assassination, but around the Kennedy presidency, Kennedy in Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In all of these areas, this very strong law, the JFK Records Act, has had this very positive effect on our understanding of our own history. So what do we know now that we didn't know in 1992? And the thing that strikes me, and I've written a book about this, I have a biography of James Angleton coming out later this year. As an author, I would be remiss in not marketing it at every opportunity. So I'm starting right now with you. And in the book, I tell the story that I think is really the most significant thing that we didn't know in 1992. Some of us, as we began to get into the records, start to get interested in that, and I glommed onto it and met John Newman at the time, which was, what did the CIA know about Oswald before the assassination? And the official story was that there was this guy Oswald, they paid kind of routine attention to him, and he did this and he did that, and they knew this and that, and then he shot the president, and boy, everybody was really surprised. How did this guy come out of nowhere and shoot the president? That was the story that the Warren Commission was told by the CIA and by the FBI. Okay, that story was a lie. That story was concocted by Jim Angleton and Dick Helms, and it was a lie. Oswald was watched closely from November 1959 when he defected to the Soviet Union. His time in the Soviet Union was examined closely. A group of CIA officers, anywhere from a minimum of 6 and probably as many as 15 people, were well acquainted with his file. His file was handled in a very unusual way. From the moment he defected, all information about Oswald was not sent to the Soviet Russia division, but was sent to James Angleton's office, and the Oswald file was held very closely. None of this was known in 1992. None of this was known to Oliver Stone. And this is the story that we are beginning to piece together now. And I tell part of it in my forthcoming book, and John is telling the story in some more detail. But this is what we know now that we didn't know then. The CIA surveillance of Oswald from 1959 to 1963. Very close. These CIA officials, and I can name them, Jane Roman, Bill Hood, Tom Karamessinis, James Angleton. These officials knew Oswald. They were familiar with his biography. They knew his family. They knew about his crazy mother. They were opening her letters to the State Department. They were getting the FBI reports on Oswald. They were getting the State Department reports. All of that information was funneled into the CIA and landed in the counterintelligence staff in a very closely held office. And the file was controlled by a woman named Ann Edgeter, who was totally unknown to the Warren Commission. And the story of this, how this information about Oswald was handled, was totally unknown. And now we begin to have a little bit closer understanding of that and what that means. I think that's the kind of the baseline that we are now working on. What will the files that are now coming out going to tell us about that story? Which is a remarkable story. If it had been known in 1963, the whole investigation would have been quite different. There's good reason to believe that, in fact, the counterintelligence staff even knew that Oswald was in Dallas. And I'll tell that story in my book. So the level of pre-assassination of knowledge about Oswald was very great. And the work of the review board enabled us to start investigating that story. And thanks to the records released by the review board, I went out and was able to interview people who had extensive pre-assassination knowledge of Oswald. Jane Roman, who was a key aide to Angleton, talked to John and I. I had 2 conversations with Bill Hood, who was a lifetime counterintelligence officer associated with Angleton. Ann Goodpasture worked for Wynne Scott in Mexico City. She had worked for Angleton in headquarters. So we really began to understand this pre-assassination monitoring of Oswald. And that's the story that the releases later this year hopefully can amplify and tell us more about. So one challenge is to understand what we already know and make that the foundation of what comes out in October. You know, we are assuming that the agencies are going to let this information be released because that's what the law obliges. But, you know, given their behavior, I'm skeptical. And I worry that we are going to have continued obfuscation after or around the releases in October. But this is where the role of the president is very important, because if the agencies want to do that, if they want to do it lawfully, the president has to sign off on it. And would President Trump do that? We don't know. So there's a lot of imponderables going forward. But we do know a great deal about what's in those records. And I think these are some of the records that can shed more light on the counterintelligence staff's extraordinary and intense interest in Lee Harvey Oswald from 1959 to 1963. And I'll just name a few that I think are, that we know they exist and we know that they're supposed to be made public. First is the interrogation of Yuri Nasenko, who was a KGB defector who defected in 1964 and said, falsely, it turns out, that the KGB really had no interest in Oswald at the time he was in the Soviet Union. Angleton didn't believe this, thought he was a phony defector, and threw him in jail. It was one of the first examples of a CIA black site where somebody was detained beyond the law without due process. There's about 2,000 pages of, as far as we can tell, of the interrogation of Yuri Nasenko between 1964 and 1969. And the interrogation of Nasenko about what he knew about the Oswald file could be potentially very interesting. It may also, there may be nothing about Oswald in there. It may be all about other matters. But Angleton's conspiracy theory was that the KGB was somehow behind Nasenko and somehow behind Oswald. So the Nasenko interrogation transcripts will tell us more about Angleton's conspiracy theory of JFK. A second category is the operational files of Bill Harvey, who was in charge of the CIA assassination operations from 1960 to 1963, and was also a bitter enemy of the Kennedys. There's a couple hundred pages of material about Bill Harvey. David Atlee Phillips was chief of Cuban operations in Mexico City, went on to become chief of the Western Hemisphere Division of the CIA, object of intense scrutiny by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. There's about 600 pages of material about David Phillips' operations in the withheld material. So that might have relevant information. People have alluded before to the story of George Ioannidis. He was a counterintelligence psychological warfare officer in Miami. He worked for David Phillips. My lawsuit identified probably about 50 records, we don't know how many pages, of his operational activities in Miami in 1962 and 1964. One thing that we have learned over the years is that, in fact, and this was not disclosed to the review board, not only did Joanides' agents have contact with Oswald before the assassination, but Joanides himself had a residence in New Orleans in 1963 and 64, a story that has never been explained by the CIA. So those records may be relevant. And then finally, Ann Goodpasture, who worked for Angleton and who worked for Win Scott, and who wrote the CIA history of the Mexico City station. There's a couple hundred pages on her in the unreleased material. So you have this nexus of counterintelligence officers, people who knew about Oswald and were interested in Oswald before the assassination, and people who were interested in assassination activities. And in this nexus is where I believe we will find information that will tell us more about the causes of the president's death. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Jeff. Just think where we would be with regard to the JFK assassination if Jefferson Morley had been the editor of the Washington Post instead of Bill Bradley. He had a tough road to hoe. I don't know any details, but I know that the Washington Post has not been in the forefront of ferreting out all the information about this. Some questions, please, for a few minutes. Yes, sir, please.
I'm Jason Forden, an independent journalist. I was wondering if you could discuss for a minute the CIA, in which you mentioned Director Helms had lied about the Oswald investigation. He was also convicted or charged with perjury for lying to the Church Committee about CIA involvement in Chile. His lawyer, Edward Bennett Williams, remarked at the time that he would wear that conviction as a badge of honor. It's worth noting they negotiated a plea bargain. He was fined $2,000 and said some very defiant things about Congress after that. Worth noting that Edward Bennett Williams also represented John Hinckley, and the judge that negotiated that plea bargain was the same judge that presided over the Hinckley trial. So could you discuss at all this attitude by these very well-known men at the time, blatantly lying to the public, proud of it, and how that plays into this situation?
Well, let's put the best possible face on it, which is what I think Helms or his admirers would do, and there are many in Washington. He was CIA director for 7 years, and I've talked to many people at the CIA who thought he was one of the best directors ever. The favorable way to look at that would be, it was a Cold War. These men were assigned to do clandestine work. They worked for the president with the expectation that their work would remain secret. As one CIA officer said, their operations would remain secret from conception to eternity. And that's the world that these men lived in. And so that gave them a certain arrogance and to do that. I mean, the striking thing to me now, looking back on what we've learned since the review board started, was Helms and Angleton both obstructed justice in a homicide case, and they committed perjury. Why, if the homicide case was so cut and dried, would these men obstruct justice and commit perjury? And we still don't have a good answer to that question. Maybe some of these records will begin to tell us what were these operations that they were so loath to disclose be. So, but to get to your point, I mean, even if we accept the most charitable interpretation of their actions, that this was justified by the Cold War and they were engaged in deadly business and the government approved, the Cold War is over. And the national security considerations that are in play there are totally irrelevant. The threats the country faces now are nothing like those threats. And so we need not have excessive secrecy around this topic. Whatever the justification of it once was, there is no justification now.
Jeff, in fact, at the first meeting of the Warren Commission, didn't Dulles tell the rest of the commissioners, when asked, that they would lie even to the president if asked?
That was the ethos, yeah. Yeah.
It seems to me somewhat problematic that you have a commission that goes out of business before the time for compliance with the law finishes. I'm curious as to why nobody is proposing the calling back the ARB into existence to finish the job, which obviously it did not finish.
Well, what I alluded to before, I think, calls for some measure like that, an independent body that can review these records, people who have the security clearances, and can decide, does this meet the statutory definition of assassination related or not. Because I expect some obfuscation, that's why I think we do need an independent board mechanism. It doesn't have to be as big as the review board. The remaining job is not huge. This is not a huge batch of records that remains, not like the original batch of records that the AARB dealt with. But there could be, 3 people with the requisite security clearances and some familiarity with the subject who could review these records and who would be independent of the agencies, because without an enforcement mechanism, we can expect them to obfuscate and delay and conceal.
Thanks.
Just one. I just want to understand that there are many times there are people who are on the radar of, like even in if you see the Paris attacks, the recent attacks in Europe, in Brussels, and those people are on the radar, they slipped and they committed.
Right.
In this, and there is no conspiracy, there is nothing, investigate, like why did it happen, because why in this case we feel that there is something beyond, like we can just say he just slipped out of the radar and did it.
That's quite possible. And when we see all the records, we'll be able to decide that. But until we have all the records, we can't decide whether, for example, Angleton could have been manipulating Oswald. He and his people could have been manipulating Oswald over the course of those 4 years. That's what they did. They ran secret operations involving agents, and they kept it secret. So when we have all the records, then we can address the question of conspiracy. I'm not interested in the question of conspiracy. I'm only interested in full disclosure. When we have that, then we can talk about the theories.
Thanks.